Hello everyone, and welcome to the Dice Commando YouTube channel. I'm Andrew, with you here as always. This is the Commando Cast, a video cast about all things Star Wars Destiny. This video and others like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. Please show your support with a like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the bell notification icon so you don't miss any new videos. If you want to get involved with the channel, consider becoming a channel member. There are many benefits to channel membership, including access to our Discord, exclusive deck tech and strategy videos, and the opportunity to help create channel content. I want to sincerely thank all our channel members, as I truly couldn't do this without your support. You guys rock. Go Commando. CCGs, TCGs, and other similar games will often fundamentally boil down to being an exercise in value. Basically, what do I pay? What do I get? What does it cost me? And what will I get back out of it? Now, more often than not, it's the player who's able to get the better value out of their resources and their actions over the course of the game that will ultimately emerge victorious. In Magic, spending 2 mana on a card from hand to counter a much larger, costlier spell gains you advantage. In Flesh and Blood, spending a card that causes your opponent to either spend 2 card equivalent or take damage will put you ahead. And in Star Wars Destiny, we're faced with decisions like, do I pay 1 resource in a card from hand to remove a die? Or do I use that resource to resolve a 3-for-1 melee against my opponent, leaving me a card for a reroll? Now, there are many types of costs in Destiny. Resources, of course, but also cards from hand, cards from deck, action economy, health even, and so on. These are the more straightforward costs. There are in-game costs. But Destiny also has a number of opportunity-type costs that are paid really before the game even starts. For example, character selection will inherently dictate the cards we can and can't bring to the table to begin with. A high payout card can thus be restricted to certain character types, but become useless, let's say if your yellow character goes down or if you lose your Sith. With the way that Destiny plays out and as metas develop and drive team comp choices, it becomes inevitable, though, that some of these high-value cards find their way into situations that takes them beyond their original design thought. So in today's episode, I'm asking the question, when is a cost not actually that costly? Hey Destiny folks, welcome back to the Commando Cast. Thanks for joining me today. Happy Friday. Hope your week's been going well. I'm definitely looking forward to the weekend, and I hope you are as well. So this topics that we're talking about today is, I've been thinking about it for the last couple of months across the various games that I play. But specifically, I wanted to talk about it today in Star Wars Destiny in terms of the actual cost of something versus the perceived cost of something, and actually more so in the reverse is the perceived cost of a card. Does it match up with what the actual cost of that card is? Right? And this matters not only to make us better players, but to help us build our decks better, and also can help us when we're looking at the design of a card going forward. Is it too good? Is it not good enough? And so on. Right? When we're looking at the set, is this something worth looking at? Is this something I can abuse? And so on. So before we get into this too much, let's go ahead and baseline really on the concept of a cost. Right? It's very easy for us to say, well, it cost me 1 resource to play this card. The cost is 1 resource. And while that's true, we all know that that there are many more costs in Destiny. For example, like the one we just used, playing a card from your hand costs you more than the 1 resource that it costs to play it, because it costs you a card from your hand, right? Which means that at the very minimum, it's less rerolls that we can make, right? It gives us less options available, right? We also have in addition to the physical resource, the little token on the table, we have a resource of cards in hand. And stuff like that, right? So the actual, what is the actual cost of that card doesn't match up with what the perceived cost of that card. And we also have additional costs in terms of playing this game, in that we're limited to 30 cards in our deck. We're limited to 30 points of characters on the table. So if I put 1 card in my deck, that means that I can't put, if I put 1 card in my deck, there are other cards that I can't put in because I'm just running out of space. And the characters that I select limit the cards that I can bring to the table, which means that there's a cost to that, even above and beyond the point cost of the character. So kind of one of the things that led me to this conversation altogether, and if you'll indulge me for a second, I actually want to go talk about the big evil. I want to go talk about Magic. So the new set, actually it's not the new set anymore, but Kaldheim released this is one of a recent expansion of Magic, released several months back, and it re-released the concept of snow lands, which is a mechanic that's been in Magic for a while, but they're re-bringing it back. So what I'm showing up right here at the top of the screen, you have Shock. Now, Shock is a fundamental card in Magic that for 1 red mana, you deal 2 damage to any target. Now, many people, because it'll be relevant, many people are familiar with Lightning Bolt. One of like the OG, actually not one of like the OG burn spell in Magic was 1 for 3. And it's, over the years as Magic has developed, they've actually found that the 1 for 3 is a little too high in curve for where they were. So Shock has really become the new Lightning Bolt, right? Shock is kind of the fundamental establishment of what the cost curve is in Magic. Now, with the introduction in Kaldheim, or the reintroduction in Kaldheim of the Snowlands, you see that card there, Frostbite. Frostbite deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. It's 1 red mana, so it's right on curve with Shock. However, it has, if you control 3 or more snow permanents, deal 3 damage instead. So there's a lot going on here, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but let's go ahead and walk this through, right? So the Snow Mountain is a basic land, and it plays just the same as a non-Snow Mountain. So there's no reason to not just add, right? There's no reason to play, for this purpose, if you're going to play Frostbite, there's no reason to just run regular mountains. Now, there's a perceived, or kind of a more of a restriction type cost on the Snow Mountains, being that, or the Snow Permanents, I should say, in that if you're trying to run a multicolored deck, there are less options available for you in terms of running cards that could produce different types of colored mana. Right, so that is a little more restrictive for those types of decks, so you have to be very careful how you choose. However, if you're playing a mono red burn deck, there's zero reason to not just make all of your mountains Snow Mountains, and then you can play this card, right? So in the right type of deck, in this case in a red burn deck, there is no cost to running Frostbite, right? There's no downside to running Frostbite because it already hits for the same as Shock, and you get the bonus out of it, right? So with that said, and again, thank you for indulging me, but I think this example kind of sets the baseline for a lot of our conversations today is, in theory, there are additional costs that you have to pay to run Snowlands. But in the right type of deck, there isn't, right? So that kind of sets the stage for, what's the actual cost? In this case, is the cost of running Frostbite, is the cost of running Snowlands for Frostbite, does it cost me anything? And the answer is, in the right type of deck, no, it doesn't, right? It does not cost you anything. The effective cost is not there. So we can start to apply that if we look at, well, let's actually go ahead and we'll just go over, before we get into, the different types of costs. Let's go look at Isolation, right? Isolation is a fundamental card in Star Wars Destiny. It has the spot requirement, right? Spot a blue character to remove a character die. Okay, so you have, right, so I just want to, remind everybody of the basic cost curve, or at least what used to be the basic cost curve in Destiny, which was really 1 resource, card from hand, is removal with restriction. And in this case, we have 1 resource, card from hand, and restriction for essentially a unvalue capped card, right? You compare that to, I'll go ahead and throw Electroshock up, right? Electroshock, in this case, is 2 or less, right? So Isolation having the additional restriction there, so Isolation has no cap, but it has to be a character card to remove, right? So that's where, you get into, in this case, Shock is 1, card from hand, restriction of spotting, 2 or less. Isolation is 1, card from hand, restriction of spotting, restriction of character die, but no cap, right? So they're fundamentally-ish equivalent cards. Okay, so the Isolation's an interesting discussion, kind of to fundamentally set the stage for this, because obviously if your blue character goes down, Isolation becomes worthless, right? But in a mono deck, this restriction goes away. But in theory, this restriction is offset by the fact that you would sacrifice access to other colors, right? So in a blue-red deck, I would get access, blue villain red, a villain blue red deck, I would have access to both blue and red cards. But some of my cards, the spot cards, become less effective, or actually they become useless once the corresponding person of that color goes down, right? So there's a restriction type trade-off there that they can thus use in the design to make the cards more or less useless, or more or less capped, right? That's a better way to say it. More or less capped. They can kind of do something a little higher on the power side because it has that natural bring down restriction. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the different types of costs. Specifically in Star Wars Destiny, we have the actual costs, right? We've already talked about that one. That's, what does it actually cost me? One resource, card from hand, something like that. We then have these perceived costs, which is kind of what more we were talking about on isolation. Wait, what does it look like it costs me? And then does it actually cost me that? And then we have, like we've already been talking about, the restriction costs, this is really where design choices start to come in. And then we have, lastly, and this kind of fits in with perceived as well, but these are your opportunity costs. And the opportunity cost is basically, if I'm playing this, it means I can't play something else, right? So would something else be a better value for me? And primarily what we're going to be talking about today are really the perceived cost versus the actual cost. So let's go ahead one more time. We'll go back to Magic and look at the general concept of how that, I think most people are familiar with how that game works. So if you want to run a deck that plays multiple colors, you have to be able to get the lands, you have to be able to get the mana in play to play the cards of those various colors. So you increase your access, but it becomes harder to be able to play everything, right? At least in theory, right? If I want to play a red, blue, three color deck, I have to be able to get 3 of those mana on the table, which is a lot harder to do than if I'm playing a mono deck. So yes, I have more access, but it's harder to do. Star Wars Destiny, from a color standpoint, doesn't really do that to the same extent, right? I can play a 2-color deck, I can play a 3-color deck, a lot of times without actually taking a penalty, right? Now, in theory, right, those spot cards that we've talked about, shock, isolation, etc., they really, those are what put the, kind of the counterbalances to that, if I want to play a whole bunch of the really powerful stuff, I have to make sure the color of that character is alive. But as you guys are well aware, the spot cards are pretty few and far between all in all. Now, I do want to give a shout out to Renewed Hope. Faltering Allegiances actually did a really good job. I think with that, they had a lot of, you have Unending Hate, cards like that where you get a bonus out of them, or you have to spot, in that case, spotter Inquisitor or Sith, right? We've seen plenty of decks out there that are even mono blue, that when they lose their Sith versus their Apprentice, they're still hamstrung on a lot of their good cards. And I think Faltering Allegiances did a really good job, specifically bringing a lot of cards to the table where there's a really high impact, but there is a higher, not just perceived cost, but actual cost in bringing that card to your deck. On the flip side, the perceived cost of being able to bring Field Medic if you run a red character is not as high, right? There basically is no perceived cost there, right? So that's one place where I think Destiny inherently, over the course of the game, as they've really swung away from a lot of those spot cards. Again, it's not a secret to anybody that playing Rainbow, right? That's why playing Rainbow was so good, is you could play all the good stuff, and most of the good stuff, or at least most of the functional stuff, didn't have a spot requirement, right? So that's where, as we go farther and farther in design, and as we go farther and farther in our selection, as we start to see more cards that require spot but have higher value, it's going to drag us back to the mono or the more restricted type decks, right? So the next one, let's go ahead and bring up Pirate Loyalist. So this is a really good conversation in terms of perceived cost versus actual cost. Now, Pirate Loyalist, again, so I'm not even, right, the power action has been, as of the time of the shooting, the power action's gone. He's just a blank character at this point. So that's not part of this conversation. But instead, what I want to do is I want to talk about him just in terms of his die, right? One of the things that I think we've consistently failed at, and this is not ARH design specific, this is Destiny specific, right? One of the things that we've failed at is truly understanding what blanks mean on cards. And I think Pirate Loyalist is a great example of that. What we're supposed to do, I think, from a perceived cost standpoint, what we're supposed to do is look at Pirate Loyalist and say, this is not a good card because he has 3 blanks, or it's not a good die, because he has 3 blanks. But realistically, right, in a real cost standpoint or a real world standpoint, the Pirate Loyalist die is actually really, really, really good because he has 2 sides that don't cost anything, and he has that resource. So if you look at him from, an EV standpoint, he's got a 2, and a 1, so he's 5, so he's less than 1, right? 5 divided by 6. So in that case, you're like, less than 1 for 7 points. I don't know about that. But again, we're kind of forgetting that over the course of Destiny, specifically I believe it was mid Legacies, we saw a significant curve shift in focus, right? And I can prove that, right? Look at Awakening's Luke. Look at Spirit of Rebellion Obi-Wan, right? Those are 20-point characters that have 1 and 2 focus. And now you look at, specifically some of the Convergence guys, or even later, we're looking at 2 focus sides. We're seeing upgrades with 3 focus sides, right? That wasn't something that we used to see. So the weight of a blank used to be significantly different than it is now. So that's why I'm saying if you look at Pirate Loyalist, he's kind of the like textbook example of that, is we're like, oh my God, he has 3 blanks. What a bad die. No, not really, right? Because you now have a wider array of focus. If you're playing that Hondo Admiral deck, the second time you roll out that Admiral and you're not looking for the special anymore, that 3 focus looks pretty damn good. And along those same lines, to look at the Loyalist and say, well, because I'm designing him with 3 blanks, I can counter that by giving him 2 sides that I don't have to pay for, is not truly understanding the actual real cost, the actual real effect of that die and how it works. And that kind of brings me, I think to my ultimate point today. I mean, of course, we're just doing, a generic review, but kind of bringing me towards my conclusion is that over the course of Destiny, as we've gotten away from, and specifically I'm talking about FFG Destiny, but by and large, started moving away from the spot mechanic. And if let's go ahead and put that in concept of, well, let's back up and let's put spot mechanic in terms of concept and the impact of the game on easy pickings and entangle even from Legacies, right? Those being yellow spots, from a hero standpoint especially, it made it very, very difficult from a hero standpoint to not try and include yellow, which then drove, like, you didn't see that many, aside from, like your piddly vehicle decks, you didn't see a whole lot of rainbow hero stuff. Right? We overall didn't see a bunch. And generally when you'd sit down against like a wide hero deck, you'd take down the yellow character. Like that was generally, you'd go kill that higher gun or whatever it was, right? That was the way we did it, to try and turn off that yellow spot, because the yellow spot cards were so impactful. You flip and you look that on the villain side, right? Your Afro rainbows and stuff like that, they didn't have all that many spot requirements. The only one one of the major ones they played, of course, was automated defense, but that's spot a droid, and then you're spotting your supports, right? So by and large, there wasn't a huge impact to those villain-wide decks, your Jabba, Watt, Sentinel. They don't play a whole bunch of spot-type cards in there. And the ones that they do are not as critical to their strategy as it might have been in Hero, right? So with again, that was kind of a little aside as well, but I think it kind of helps to back up my point, is that the underutilization of the spot mechanic also helped drive, in addition to the resource curve change and stuff like that, really helped drive, I think, the game to where it was. And that's where I'm hoping is that going forward, we can kind of reinvigorate the spot mechanic to help really drive things forward and kind of keep the meta in check. I think it's a very valuable tool that by and large FFG underutilized. And again, I want to give shout out to the Faltering Allegiance team specifically on that. There was a lot of cards in there that, yes, had to be eroded and capped, but there was a lot of that, like how often have people seen that their Sith died and they can't use it anymore, right? I mean, that's basically what we should be seeing, is that there has to be an opportunity cost of putting that in your deck or having to build around it. Restrictive type costs are typically paid in the design themselves, right? And this allows design to use these restriction costs to produce higher or above power curves that, at least in theory, are kept in check by those restrictions. And that's why in looking at stuff like that, we should be asking ourselves, what is the perceived cost of this card versus what does it actually cost me? And if what it actually costs me is not much, then what we're likely looking at is a card that's probably going to be very good that we should consider putting in our deck. But by analogy or by effect, it is likely going to become a steta in the meta for a significant period of time. And that, for the most part, is the crux of today's conversation, right? But I really wanted to use that magic example before to say, we're putting this additional cost on the card, or we're putting this additional requirement on the card, but what does that actually cost us? And if the cost is nothing, then that's something that we as deck builders need to look at and say, okay, this is supposedly costing me something, but it doesn't really, so I get a better impact out of it. And that's a card that's naturally going to gravitate towards seeing your deck, and by analogy, or by effect, it's going to become a meta staple type card, right? You look at cards like Forsaken and stuff like that, right? There's very little cost effectively to Forsaken, right? And that's why it's in every deck, right? Your hidden motives were in every deck, right? Stuff like that. Whereas, obviously your unending hates are only going to be in very specific decks, so it becomes easier for designers to keep that in check overall. All right, folks, that does it for me today, but I'd love to hear from you guys as well. What are some other, kind of classic examples, or maybe even non-classic examples in Star Wars Destiny of really the perceived cost, right? Thinking, oh, well, maybe this is not a good card versus the value, or even maybe where it does have a high perceived cost, but the value is off the chart and stuff like that, right? And, I'd love to see the stuff below, because it can help us kind of learn and put things in context, and maybe figure out how to build our decks, and by proxy what'll kind of drive the eventual long-term meta going forward. So anyway, thanks very much for joining me today, folks. Hope this was an interesting discussion. If nothing else, go Commando.